I mean a very quick review of what we did last week. The reason being that there's some material that we did last week I think will be pertinent today. Let's very quickly take a look at what we were doing. We were looking at the fact that there was a place in the book of Genesis, chapter 11, where we switched from one story to another story. We switched from the time of the Tower of Babel, which was around 10,000 BC, to the time of Terror, which was around 1700 BC, a period of about 10,000 years. And there's nothing in the Bible, nothing in Genesis about that period of time at all. But what I was trying to point out is that hopefully we can, from archaeology, learn something about the history of a period that is not covered in the Bible. In the slides last week, I showed you a chart of the periodic, the archaeological periods that are covered in that 10,000 years, all the way from the Stone Age into the Bronze Age. Where it becomes of interest to us is in the early Bronze Age, because in the early Bronze Age something happened that was really quite significant in Sumer. Sumer was one of the southern parts of the Mesopotamian territory, way down near the Persian Gulf, Sumer, and it is generally regarded as being important because it might be the first, what you might call, organized city that we had, organized society that we had in the Western world. And the period of Sumer dates from 4500 BC to about 1900 BC. But the significant things, the thing that these people covered. Oh, here's a good map of Sumer. I want to point out there are some interesting cities here. These three are interesting: Ur, Uruk, and Kish. We'll mention some of these a little bit later on. Contributions are made by the Sumerians. The one we're interested in right now is that they invented one of the first forms of writing, because we're going to be interested in writing in some of the things that we're going to cover today. Their writing was of an interesting form. They wrote on pieces of clay with a stylus that had a conical shape, and from the way they placed those little cones, they could get a meaningful message. This is what one of those tablets would look like. I mentioned King Ashurbanipal here because he was a very significant part in this, but he lived very much later. Banipal was one of the last of the Assyrian kings, almost next to the last king. And one of the things that he did during his reign was to establish a library where, pretty much as a hobby, maybe like a stamp collector, he collected as many of these tablets that he could possibly find. There were a lot of them because once that clay had set, if it were fired at all, it could never be destroyed again. And a lot of them were set in the sun and all that. So he had a library that was filled with that kind of material. That royal library had about 30,000 of these clay tablets in it. The library was dormant for many, many years until 1849, when a British explorer by the name of Layard came across that library of Ashurbanipal and discovered all these clay tablets. I've got a picture of the Layard, and there's a picture, not of the library, but that's of his palace, which shows you what the library might very well have been like. This is what the library did look like, rows and rows of all these different tablets. Once that library had been discovered, what happened next is that most of those tablets were shipped off to London, shipped off to England, and there they were available from 1850 on to be studied by archaeologists to try to find out what the language was and what the language had to say about the period that was being written, centuries, actually thousands of years before. Here's the Fertile Crescent. I just want to mention that because we're going to switch real suddenly, start talking about something that's very different from what we've talked about in the last couple of weeks. We're going to talk about some real history. We're going to talk about something that actually happened and talk about one of the people that we get to know from those tablets, and that is Sargon. Sargon of Akkad or Akkad, depends on how you want to pronounce it. Sargon has a middle name. I think Warren knows what Sargon's middle name is. Sargon the Great. No. He was the first of the really great, he was the first emperor that we know of in the old world. Fascinating individual in many ways. He lived around 2300, actually he died, he was born around 2350 BC, and starts to become of some significance shortly after, around 2330 BC. We start to learn a little bit about him. He's called Sargon. Now that word, I looked that up in the internet, and it's called Akkad or Akkad. One of the things is with the accent on the first syllable, and then the person pronounces it with the accent on the second syllable. What do? Then you take your choice. I'll call it Akkad because it sounds very much like another word we use. He was the first of these rulers, but it gets interesting when we try to find out some things about him. According to the legend, I'll check that word legend, a gardener found a baby floating in a basket on a river and raised him as his own child. This baby later became the Akkadian emperor Sargon. Sargon is believed to be the first military leaders to use soldiers armed with bows and arrows. Well, that's just a little bit, but the key word here is legend. There was a legend associated with him. A guy by the name of Sir Henry Rawlinson in 1867 was browsing through those tablets when he came across something that was called the Legend of Sargon. The Legend of Sargon. And what that legend was this story. I think I mentioned this before. Well, this is part of the legend. According to the legend, there was a baby that was found. And I'll go to check this one also. Sargon gained loyalty from his soldiers by eating with them every day. He was very popular with his soldiers. According to the legend, this is Sargon writing about himself now. The brothers of my father loved the hills, my city, which is situated in the banks of the Euphrates. It's in that city of Kish. My high priestess mother conceived me in secret and bore me. She sent me in a basket of rushes with bitumen and sealed my lid. She cast me into the river which rose over me. My mother was a high priestess. My father I knew not. Does that kind of ring a bell? As a matter of fact, you'd be surprised how many times I came across mention of the fact that this is the same story as what? Moses. As a matter of fact, I did have one slide I didn't include it. It showed Moses and Sargon on the same slide. They both had a similar beginning of being put in a basket or a box and put in the river. The difference being in Moses, he was rescued by a princess. In the case of Sargon, so the river bore me up and carried me to Akkad. The drawer of water, Akkad, the drawer of water, took me to his son and reared me. Akkad, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. While I was his gardener, Ishtar granted me her love, and for 4 and so many years, I exercised kingdom. Well, actually, a whole lot's abbreviated here. First of all, this guy, Akkad, actually was the king's gardener. He was the gardener of the king according to the legend. And so what we find is that Sargon was brought up very close to the kingship, being associated with his father, who was the gardener of the king. But then it also mentions Ishtar granted me her love. What was she? She was a goddess. As a matter of fact, I have a slide here that shows a picture of Sargon when he was growing up, a very handsome fellow, a very charismatic fellow. This is that goddess of love. She fell in love with, this is a kind of a complicated story, to say the least. At least maybe through his father, maybe through Ishtar. We don't know exactly how it happened, but he was appointed to be the king's cupbearer. Now that gives a position to a person that is rather unique. He had quite a bit of contact with the king in that fashion, and apparently did find favor with the king, and it wasn't long before he was in a position where he actually had some power. He says, rising, said, this is again from the legend. This is Sargon writing about himself. Rising, therefore, without help of influential relations, he attained the post of cupbearer to the ruler of the city of Kish in the north of the ancient land of Sumer. Well, this is writing about it. Here is the thing that he was worried about. He may very well have been born into the royalty. He may have been born into one of the higher classes of the society of Sumer at that time. He had ambitions. Well, his ambitions, I think, are shown on the next slide. The ambitions was to create an empire. Actually, a couple of places that I read about it, they call him the inventor of the idea of empire. Apparently, nobody had thought about it before, but the idea was this. The way society worked at that time, there were all little individual towns, and each town had its own government, and each town took care of itself. Sargon got the idea that it might be much more efficient to have a number of these towns working together and create an empire of a number of these different towns, and not have a ruler in each town, but have one person be the head of that whole empire. Guess who he had in mind for that job? This is where he got the idea of creating an empire. Now, the story gets kind of complicated here in this regard, because when he was in this position of power, he noted something else that was rather significant in the way those towns were being run. Each town was quite independent. If they had trouble with another town, they would have to go to war. The way they went to war was to conscript some of the citizens to have warriors, and they would go out and fight. As soon as the war was, whatever battle there was over, they'd come back and they'd go back to their job. Sargon invented this idea of a standing army. Why not have an army that stays put, and that people become professional soldiers, not just part-time soldiers? When you read about this, you think about the chicken and the egg. Was it the invention of the army, or was it the invention of the empire that came first? If he had the army, he would have the power to be able to get to where he wanted to and get control over some of these other cities. And that way he could become the emperor. Or was it the fact that he already was the emperor, that he had the ability to create this army? One way or the other, it's kind of hard to say. What we do know, and again, the tablets that we find in Ashurbanipal's library there indicate that he was very successful in becoming an empire. And he did create an empire. He created an empire, I think I have shown it here. This is the size of his empire. See this whole yellow portion here? Actually, the empire ran all the way from the Persian Gulf here, all the way to the Mediterranean, covering this whole section of the Fertile Crescent. That's not the whole world, but as far as he was concerned, that covered the better part of the world. I want to draw your attention to this part that's in red. It's called Elam. This is where the Elamites lived, and we will be talking about them a little bit later. This is one of the older maps because it actually shows the Tigris and Euphrates rivers on here not being joined together. Mesopotamia means what? Between the two rivers. And that's what this place was. It was between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River is coming down here. The Tigris River is coming here. They're all coming from up in the mountains up in here. Eventually, this whole region here gets covered with swampland, and the Tigris and Euphrates actually join together to form a single river flowing into the Persian Gulf. But you notice that he does cover quite a bit of territory. The area he came from, Sumer, where he was supposedly born in the city of Kish, is just this little small part. So he was rather successful at gaining an empire. How? By conquering Sumer. The first thing he did was take on his own people. And we actually have records of the fact that he did manage to conquer two of the leading cities of Sumer, of this flourishing society that existed at that time, Ur, and Uruk. And these are Sargon's own words. These were written by Sargon, and these were not found in the library, but found in another place where there are a lot of tablets that were stored that covered his life. That's it. That's the conquest of. Here's another one. I'll get back to that. This one of these is Uruk, and one of these is Ur. There are a lot of things that could be said about all the things that Sargon had done, but there are two things that are significant that we want to keep in mind. One of them is this. He concocted this idea of an empire. It seems incredible that nobody had done that before. There is some history that indicates there might have been something like an empire somewhere in China or maybe in India. But as far as the Western world was concerned, Sargon was the first one to create an empire in the Western world. And the other is that he developed the Akkadian language. Now, I want to go back to this map. If you take a look at this map, you see right in the middle here is Akkad. The map doesn't show it all that well. This is where he had set himself up. This is where you might say his throne was when he was the emperor. Somewhere between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, when they seem to get together, then they diverge again. This is where Akkad was, or Akkad, or whatever you want to call it. This was his capital. And of course, it is thriving with all the information we want about Sargon, except for one thing. They don't know where it is. They've never found where that Akkad actually is. It's very near Babylon. The city of Babylon is right in that same region, but they have not yet uncovered everything that they would expect to find if they were actually to find that city of Akkad. Akkad resulted in something else. This being the center, and we had all of these different peoples coming in here. It wasn't too long before something very interesting happened. They seemed to adopt a universal language. It's called Akkadian. The Akkadian language was a language that was used throughout that area. Why? Because they had to communicate with each other. They may have had different language down here in Sumer from what they might have had up here in Upper Mesopotamia. But if they had a common language, they could at least communicate readily. And it wasn't long before this Akkadian language became sort of the universal language of that whole area. As a matter of fact, of the whole eastern plateau. Everything became Akkadian as far as in terms of what? Of having some sort of a universal language. I told this story here to this class many times before, but it always made an impression on me, and that is very early in my career, I happened to get to an international meeting, and there was an international scientist. I think he was from France, I'm not particularly sure, but when he got up to give his address, he said he was now going to address this audience in the universal language of science. You know what that is? Broken English. But he was right, because by that time, throughout most of the Western world, and actually you get into the East now too, people can speak English. Do they all say it the same way? No. But do they all understand each other? Yes. And you can talk in broken English and communicate. Found that to be true when we were in the Netherlands. When we were living in the Netherlands, one of the first things we try to do is go to a store is to find somebody who could speak English. And generally, if they hope to have any business from any foreigners, they better have somebody that can speak broken English. If you tried to speak Dutch, that was very peculiar. You couldn't, even though you think you may have learned something, if you do not pronounce it completely the way the Dutch do, They do not understand you and do not make any effort to try to understand you. But when it is broken English, when you're talking with somebody using broken English, do you not make every effort to try to understand? That's exactly what happened with this Akkadian language. And it became the language of the land. So that were two contributions that we get from Sargon. That Akkadian language lasted for a long time. It lasted until about 700 BC. Akkadian was the preferred language throughout that whole land, and around 700 it changed. Why? It changed over to Aramaic. Now, what was the language that Jesus spoke? Does anybody remember? Aramaic. He spoke Aramaic because it was the accepted language. Why did Aramaic take over from the Akkadian? Why did the Aramaic language take over from the Akkadian language? Well, where did the Aramaic language come from? The Arameans. And who were they? They were the Assyrians. The what do you want to call it? The language, the Aramaic language came about around the time that the Assyrians were making their conquest in different parts of the world. In every part of the world that they would go into, the world at that time, they would take their language with them. And it was only a matter of a century or so that you find out that Aramaic became the preferred language over the Akkadian language. Oh, this shows where the Arameans come from. The Arameans come from the area, northern part of Syria, in this region out here. And the Arameans moved to the east, and it certainly moved to the west and south. Why did that great Akkadian empire of Sargon perish? You know what? They don't really know for sure. All they know is that by the year 2150 or so, there was no longer a real empire, no Akkadian empire. One of the best guesses that there had been a drought that had lasted for a decade or two, and it just ruined the economy at that time. And the ruler, by that time, of course, Sargon himself was gone. By that time, they had some rulers that were not quite as forceful and quite as powerful and effective as Sargon. And so it lasted only 180 years, and it was gone. I thought, that's an awfully small period of time. Well, you stop and think about it. This country was founded in 1776. 180 years from 1776 would be 1970s. 200 years would be 1976. Yeah. 180 years in this country is kind of amazing. We go through a Revolutionary War, a Civil War, 2 World Wars, and by 1976, what's true? We are the leading nation in the world. It's not too surprising then that Sargon's empire reached the peak that it had in a short time. But when it collapsed, guess what? It really collapsed. And what happened next? Well, let me just tell you a little bit what Sargon had done. In creating this empire, he had gone to various parts of the world. One of the parts of the world that he went to was this part called Elam. I showed you that on the red map. The people in Elam had been pretty independent and separated from the people in Sumer and from the people in Mesopotamia for centuries, well, actually for a couple of millennia. But once Sargon got in there, it got them to be a part of his empire. That idea stuck with these people on Elam. And we find out that from there on, Elam and the Elamites became a group of people that were also interested in being an empire. But what about what happened in Mesopotamia? What happened in that area? What was Sumer? What happened there is something else was created. And that was called the Roman numeral III dynasty. That's simply pronounced third dynasty. No, they talk about the third. When they talk about the third dynasty, they talk about the Roman numeral 3 dynasty, which covered this territory. I think I have a somewhat better map. Down here is Sumer. This is where the city of is. The city of that was one of the principal cities of Sumer. This is Sumer. But that third dynasty had all this territory and actually had control over this territory as well, and probably had influence in what went here. In other words, what we find out is that this third dynasty doesn't just talk about Sumer, but it talks about this whole area, which is really what? That's the area of Babylon. That's the area that later on became the great state of Babylon, the great empire of Babylon. One of the things that was also happening about this time is that the people in the valley here, or in the Mesopotamia area here, were being encroached by people that were coming from the west. They were being encroached by people called the Amorites, Amorites, the Amorites. Amorites were already occupying this part of this part of the third, I'll call it the third dynasty. So we had these, well, who were these Amorites? Well, that's kind of interesting in itself. The Amorites were they were Semitic people. They came from the west. They came from near the Mediterranean and started moving to the east, and they got into the occupied parts of Mesopotamia by the 21st century. That's one part of them as far as a people. Another part of them that's quite interesting is what kind of people were they? Well, as far as the people in Sumer were concerned, they were a bunch of second-class citizens. The reason they were a bunch of second-class citizens is that because they could also be described as being nomadic herdsmen. The people in Sumer were very interested in the fact that they had created a society that was based on what? Based on living in the same place and developing that same place, developing that town, developing an urban situation where they could divide the labor and do the harvesting they needed, create their industry in brick making, create their industry in pottery making. They had all these things that were an advantage as long as they were sticking together. These Amorites were different. They kept moving. They were nomadic. That meant they moved herdsmen. Well, what were herdsmen? Herdsmen were shepherds. What's one thing that a shepherd has to do? Feed his flock. If they ate all the grass in one territory, what does the shepherd have to do? He has to move. And this was a way of life for these people for centuries. The Amorites, all the way from the east, all the way from the west, moving in this direction, were involved in that nomadic type of living. This map is very confusing. I won't even talk about it. Oh boy. Well, I'll get back to this a little bit later. I'm switching situation a little bit here. What was happening in this third dynasty was quite interesting. These people all of a sudden found themselves living where? Living in an area that had been using the Akkadian language. They had been using the Akkadian language, but the people of the third dynasty like to think of themselves as the third dynasty because there was a first dynasty. Nobody knows what the second dynasty is, but what was the first dynasty? That was Sumer. They like to think of themselves as being the renaissance of the Sumerian society. In other words, let's bring back all the things that were great about Sumer. You can see that there would be a little bit of a conflict between those Amorites to the north and the people down to the south as far as that was concerned. But there was also another problem, and that was the problem that the people in this third dynasty, particularly the ones that are living to the south, were very much in tune to this idea of rebirth of Sumer. Let's get it back again. And let's get our literature together again. Let's get other thing that was part of our being as Sumer. Well, one of the things that was part of their being as Sumer was their language. The Sumerians had their own language. It was not Akkadian, but during the period that Sargon was the emperor, that language of the Sumers started to get lost, and these people wanted this Sumer language back. So there was a problem that existed as far as a lot of the people in the southern part of this third dynasty of wanting to revitalize the whole idea of the kind of society that we had during the first dynasty and make that into the third dynasty. And how were we going to do that? Bring back the literature that we had in the first dynasty. So what they did is try to bring back that literature. If you remember one of the slides, and I didn't call your attention to it, one of the things that was interesting in that Ashurbanipal library was the fact that they came across in that library, guess what? The Gilgamesh Epic, which was a very famous epic, or novel, you might say, the first literature that was written by the people in Sumer. We talked about the Gilgamesh Epic a couple years ago, so that you all remember that. I won't go into the details right now. This is the story where, among the different stories we have concerning Gilgamesh, is a story about this man, Unetishman, who built an ark because there was a great flood. It was one of the very first of the flood stories, and it actually predates the flood story that we have in the Old Testament by quite a bit. Very, very famous bit of literature that showed up in that library, Ashurbanipal, supposedly written in the language of the people of Sumer, but it probably was not. It was probably written by the people in the third dynasty. You're keeping this straight? The third dynasty was a group that came later on. And what was happening is that there developed a very strange situation called Sprachbund. If you know German, you'd recognize this means speech together. And what had happened is that they found a way of rewriting some of these old Sumer literature, the old Sumer tablets, in this language that had both Akkadian and it had the old Sumer language. It was Sprachbund. And actually some of the things that we have that we think were actually written in the original Sumer language were not Sumer at all, but were a combination of these two. The languages may be genetically unrelated and only distantly related, but Sprachbund characteristics gave a false impression of their being related, that they were the same thing. In other words, that Akkadian language had an influence of being able to bring us back to what was actually the language of the people in Sumer. I want to ask you a question. When you start to think about the people in the Old Testament, what were a lot of them doing? Well, what was David doing before he became king? Being a son of his father Jesse, who was what? A shepherd. They were shepherds. What was Saul's family doing? They were shepherds. What did Abraham's family do? They were shepherds. What about Isaac? What about Jacob and all his sons? They were all what? They were all shepherds. Now, in part of the Old Testament, it talks about Abraham having come from the Ur of the Chaldees. Did he come from the city of Ur? Well, he came with his father. Now, his father, Terah, moved with his family, supposedly from Ur, all the way up into Upper Mesopotamia, where he settled down in Haran. He had to move. Well, when he got there, the reason he stayed in Haran was what? Because he was a shepherd, and this was a good place to raise sheep. Now, can you imagine Terah leaving this urban community of Ur with a flock of sheep and moving all the way? No, the chances are very good that Abraham's family never was in Ur at all. As a matter of fact, if you go into history, you'd find out that Ur was destroyed approximately 400 years before Terah even comes on the scene. Was it resurrected when the third dynasty was created? We don't really know. When they're talking about the third dynasty, they're talking about Ur, Roman numeral 3. They're really talking about that whole Babylonian area. And it could very well be what? That Terah's family were not, they were Amorites. They were people that were nomadic what? Nomadic herdsmen. And he acted as a nomadic herdsman, as did his son, as did the people that followed him. Let me see what we got here. This this third dynasty started out shortly after the fall of Sargon's Akkadian dynasty, which would have made it somewhere around 2140, 2130 BC. It's kind of hard to say just exactly when it really got started, but it got started in that period. Actually, one of the references I read said it's kind of hard to say when they started or how they started because this period is quote very murky. Nobody can unravel all of it. But at any rate, that third dynasty lasted for quite a while until about 2004. Now, what happened in 2004 is it fell to whom? To the Elamites. Remember I talked about that Elam? Now, let me tell you a little bit about Elam. During the best days of Sumer, that was before, long before Sargon came on the scene. The best days of Sumer. Sumer was in the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. On the other side of the Tigris River was Elam, and that's where the Elamites lived. They were rather close to the people in Sumer. And there are a lot of things that we find that the archaeologists have found that indicate that the people in Elam lived very much like the people in Sumer. They may actually have been adopting a lot of the ideas that they had in Sumer. They probably were using the wheel. They may even have developed a system of writing and were well into agriculture. But the two never really had any real tanglements. They would fight once in a while, but not very often. The people in Elam stayed on their side of the river. The people in Sumer stayed on their side of the river, and everything worked out well for many decades, probably a couple of centuries. But after the empire of Sargon, these people in Elam started to get feisty. They wanted to be an empire as well. And what they did is they twice moved into that area that was what we call the third dynasty. They moved into that area. And the second time they actually conquered it and defeated the people at Ur. And that was the end of the third dynasty. That was the end of Sumer, and the idea of Sumer actually arising again because of what had happened with the Elamites moving in and getting control in that fashion. That's not the whole story, by the way. There's quite a bit that we know about that fall of the third dynasty because for about 20 years they kept writing things about how unhappy they were. And there are several places where you have the lament for Ur, or lamentation over the city of Ur, where they lamented over all the things that had happened because of what those Elamites had done. I just, for the fun of it, included this. This is a part of that. This is a part of that showing how bad the situation was as far as they were concerned. This is a little bit different. This is from our own Bible. You're familiar with the book of Lamentations. How many of you ever heard a sermon preached from Lamentations? I haven't. I wish Henry were here. I'd ask him how many times he's preached sermons. Lamentations was a book that was written by Jeremiah after the Israelites had been taken out of Jerusalem and brought to Babylon. And it was probably written while they were in Babylon. and lamenting over what had happened to their city, very copying what the people in the third dynasty had done. The final result was kind of an interesting one, to say the least, in some regards, because it wasn't too long after that you don't hear anything more about the third dynasty. It just sort of disappears. We do hear more about the Elamites. As a matter of fact, when we get to the book of Genesis, if you remember the story in Genesis that Abraham had to rescue his nephew Lot, because Lot had been taken captive during a skirmish involving the 5 kings. And those 5 kings were all headed by one king who was an Elamite king, indicating that those people in Elam actually did have some sort of power as far as Palestine. So they were still a factor to be considered, and not an insignificant factor in that part of the world. On the other hand, another thing was happening in that area that had been Mesopotamia, and that is that more and more these Amorites, Amorites were moving in from the west, were moving in from Syria and moving into Mesopotamia, and more and more and more of them came into that area. I think I have another slide here. Whoops. Oh yeah, this is back to chapter 11. Let me tell you what, this is that pickup verse that we have in chapter 11, where the first thing that we learn about Terah is that he plans to leave Mesopotamia. He plans to leave to go to Canaan. That's the first thing that we have as far as any action out of Terah. He was going to the land of Canaan. Well, I'll tell you a little secret. Most of what I'm going to be saying right now came to me in the last 24 hours. Gretchen's rather familiar with the fact that I keep changing this as I go along. But the more I thought about this, the more I became aware of something that I think is rather significant, and that is the movement of these Amorites from the west into Mesopotamia. More and more of them came in all the time, which makes us ask that question: were Terah and Abraham, were they actually Amorites? Were they not part of Sumer? The chances are very good they were Amorites, because they behaved like Amorites. Here's a question that I ask: were they Amorites? It turns out that when we look very carefully at what we have in the book of Genesis, we learn a lot about the customs of the people that were part of Abraham's family. In this particular case, as a part of Jacob's family. Certain marriage laws, certain things like, what did Laban say to Jacob when Jacob found out that he had married Leah instead of Rachel? It's not our custom to have a younger girl marry first. Our custom is to have the older girl marry. When we get to the situation of Jacob and Esau, great discussion over the inheritance, who would get the inheritance. Actually, when we get into the book of Deuteronomy, there are some very careful outlines on how an inheritance should be handled. There's a thing called the Levorite Marriage. You remember what the Levorite Marriage? This Levorite marriage idea is that if a man is married and dies and leaves a widow, that widow is to marry his next brother, and his brother is to father children with that widow. And those children will be regarded as the children of the man that died. That's a Levorite marriage. We have 2 instances of that in the book of Genesis. One is involving what? Involving Judah and Tamar. I don't think I covered that chapter here, but it's all about a Levorite marriage. Does anybody know of another place where the Levorite marriage becomes rather important? In the book of Ruth, Remember that Ruth was about to be married to Boaz, but Boaz had to get permission from the nearest relative to Ruth's first husband before he could marry her. Again, the Levorite marriage. These are all things that we find in the Old Testament, and they parallel almost exactly some of the things that they find in the writings that pertain to the Amorites and their customs, indicating they had the same set of customs. So very likely, Terah and Abraham should not be considered as residents that came or have their ancestry back in Sumer, but probably among these Amorites. Now I'll move ahead a little bit. As those Amorites were moving in that fashion, they were getting more and more control of Mesopotamia and moving further and further south all the time. As they were moving, they were also having a little bit of a conflict with the people in Elam, but also they must have been having some conflict amongst themselves as to who is going to be in charge of this particular parcel of land. And there was a lot of political turmoil that existed at that time. That was one problem. The other problem is that as more of these Amorites came in, the population kept growing. Well, one of the successes that Sumer had was the ability to be able to have themselves in a confined area, but develop agriculture so that they could raise enough grain, enough wheat, so that they could feed everybody that was living where they were living. Well, as more and more people came into the territory, guess what? They would have to get more and more grain, which they had to do what else? They had to get more land. Well, where are they going to get land? They're going to get land by moving north into the area that had been occupied by the old-time Amorites, by the old-time nomadic shepherds, herdsmen. And what was happening is that people in the north were, the Amorites that were in the north, slowly started to see their livelihood being taken away from them because of the fact what had been good grazing land was now being used to raise wheat. And guess what? Next year it may be a little bit worse, And what do they see? They see an impending disaster from an economic standpoint. If they continued in the way that they were living at that time, they couldn't continue because there wouldn't be enough land to support that many shepherds. What do you think they said? I gotta get out of here. I gotta leave. And that's exactly what had happened. They started to ask themselves, where do we go now if we want to continue with our way of life as Amorites, of being nomadic herdsmen? We've got to find a place where we can take our herds and live without having all this political turmoil. Actually, what I found kind of interesting when I was thinking about this was a situation of a fairly sizable immigration of these people out of Mesopotamia moving somewhere else. And where they decided to move, I think we find on this next map, they decided to move to Canaan. Now, this may not be the very best map. One of the things that I find interesting is that nobody makes a map that you want. You've got to find some map that's going to work. This map does show you what a small part of biblical lands was actually Canaan. But you'll notice that this yellow region here, this is all Hamitic. These are descendants of Ham, where these are Semitic people, descendants of Shem. The Amorites and the people in Mesopotamia were Semites. They were Semitic people. They were not Hamitic people. They wanted to go to Canaan, which was Hamitic people, which was part of Egypt. Here's Egypt right here. And actually, it was all a part of Egypt, isn't it? But this map shows you a little bit. It's not the best map in the world, but it shows you a little bit of why they chose Canaan of all places. First of all, where they were situated, they couldn't go east because then they would go into Persia. They'd have to deal with the Persians. They couldn't go south because that was Arabia, that was a desert. They couldn't go north because that was even worse yet with the Scythians, and they weren't going to be invited there. They had to go back to the west and then south into Canaan. Well, here's a map of Canaan that shows what the country was like. Here is the coastline. You find out that the Egyptians were occupying part of this coastline. In a sense, it was nothing more than an extension of the Egyptian delta, the Nile Delta. Here is Jerusalem, and here's Jerusalem right here. What are these? Those are not the Himalayas, but they are what? Hills. It was very hilly country. This area did not lend itself very well to farming. A little bit further up north, you get a little bit better in the Jezreel Valley. There are some places where they're fairly level, but most of this is hilly country and doesn't really lend itself to raising grain in the way that you would like to, but it's perfectly all right for, guess what? Sheep herding, goat herding. And this is one of the reasons they probably chose Canaan as a place to go. Also because of the fact, as far as the Egyptians were concerned, they really didn't care. They weren't interested in that part of Canaan, and let those people move in. And so little by little, actually it turned out to be a lot by lot. You remember when I was reading that section that came from Genesis, that it makes mention of the fact that Terah and his family stopped in Haran, but what? They planned to go to Canaan. Why? Because so many people in Mesopotamia, so many of those Amorites that were in Mesopotamia, saw themselves being squeezed out economically, and they had to move somewhere. And they moved in a fairly large number into Canaan and occupied Canaan. They had both a political situation and they had an economic situation. At the same time I'm thinking about this, I turn on the news and what do I find out? An emigration is taking place from California into Texas. For what reasons? The same two reasons. There were people that were Californians that were not happy with the situation, the political situation. But one of the biggest reasons that people were moving out of California is that was not a good place to make money any longer. And there was an economic reason for moving out of California. Same reasons that these Amorites felt in moving to Canaan. Well, if you have a bunch of people move out of your country, let me ask you this question. You think the people in California brag about the fact how many people are leaving? No. The people in Texas might brag about how many people are moving to Texas. The same thing is true with these Amorites. These Amorites were moving out of Mesopotamia, but do the people that remain in Mesopotamia make a fuss about it? No. They're not going to talk about what we're losing. What about the people that are having to take on all these people? Are they going to be affected by it? Well, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to take a little better, closer look at that, of how somebody else was very much affected by this mass migration of people from Mesopotamia, these Amorites, these Semitic Amorites, into Canaan. We'll look at that next week. But take a look as the people were moving out. Other people were moving in, and more Amorites moved in. As a matter of fact, they came to the point where the Amorites got control of Mesopotamia, got complete control of Mesopotamia. I think I have this on the next slide. And one of the Amorites that moved into that place was a man called Hammurabi. You heard that name before? He was the first of the Babylonian emperors. And he established, instead of Sumer or Ur or Third Dynasty or anything, he established the first Babylonian Empire. He was the first emperor of Babylonia. He was also known for another thing, and that it was the Code of Hammurabi. He was a very effective ruler, to say the very least, and decided that people had to live by a set of laws, and this set of laws is referred to as the Code of Hammurabi. We can't read this that readily, but it tells about how marriages should be conducted, how divorces be conducted, how inheritance, all what is murder and what is not murder, what is it put. You think that's had an effect on the law of business? As a matter of fact, I think I was told that there are a number of people that are portrayed in the Supreme Court of the United States that were great lawgivers. And guess who's among them? Hammurabi. Hammurabi is among the people that are on our United States Senate portrait of the lawyers. So what we have happened is that Mesopotamia suddenly is of very little interest to us from the standpoint of the Semitics. Why? Well, because it's being taken over by the Amorites, or it's being taken over by what we're now going to refer to as the Babylonians, the Babylonian Empire. But what about all these people in Canaan? What's going to happen to them? If you go back to the book of Genesis, and I pointed this out before, go back to the book of Genesis, we start out with things starting in Mesopotamia, and then they move where? They move to Palestine. Where do the Israelites end up in the book of Genesis? Does anybody remember? In Egypt. How did they get to Egypt? What is the next move that's going to occur? Is it going to be something, again, that is governed by secular history? Yes, we find out it's a secular history at that time that dictates the fact that these people are going to be moving out of Canaan into Egypt. And we'll talk about that next week. Since my time, I've got 30 seconds left. Since my time is up, we'll talk about how they ended up in Egypt, and we'll start to take a look at another aspect of history of that era, namely the history of Egypt. Because just as the people in Mesopotamia were able to get a history from the writings that they had that came from the Sumerians, guess what? The Egyptians at the same time had developed a system of writing, hieroglyphics. And again, we find that we can get a history. Next week, we'll talk about Egypt and the history of Egypt and how we find that all these Amorites that have moved from Mesopotamia into Canaan end up in Egypt.